Cyril, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Josephine. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Did I say your name right? What's the correct way to say it?
So it's a French name, so you would say Cyril Desponts, but I usually spell it out and let people choose a pronunciation. So you would say, in English, most people would say Cyril Desponts.
We'll go with Cyril Desponts until I can master my French.
That is fine.
So let's just start with a quick microphone check. Could you introduce yourself and your role at the World Bank in relation to this report? Yeah.
So my name is Cyril Desponts, and so I'm from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and I'm a senior economist at the World Bank. We have many different types of senior economists at the World Bank across various fields, education, agriculture. I'm of the type that works on microeconomics and public finance, and I cover Uganda for now. I've been covering Uganda for a few months now. And as part of the Country Climate and Development Report, CCDR, if you'd allow me one acronym, I have been part of the team who does the macroeconomic assessment of the climate risks, climate change, and the public finance implication of it.
So I'm going to ask you a bit more into that. But before we get into the report, I'm curious about your journey. What brought you to Kampala and what were you doing before you came here?
So I've been working for the World Bank for 6 years now in Washington, D.C. And prior to that, if I can go just a step back, I was already working mostly in developing countries. I was in Algeria prior to that, and I've been working in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa region and in Africa as well. And I left to DC to work for the World Bank. Now, when you're in DC, you're a bit remote from the challenges that you work on, so you travel quite a lot. I have a young family. That's not something that I enjoy that much. And so I was really trying to find a place where I could both work on topics that are very important in a country where they are development challenges to which I could contribute in the reflection, and as well as a place where that is family friendly. And Uganda really has those two things. And so I think that, I don't get to choose 100%, but I did put Uganda and Kampala as my first choice when I applied.
Was economics always part of your plan?
Yes and no. It depends what you always like. I wasn't born with an economics inclination, so no. I always liked I like big topics, right? Structural topics. So I like history. I like political science and international relations, and I like economics because it touches upon a lot of different things that of day-to-day issues and problems. And I was also a bit of a quantitative person, so economics sort of blends the two, right? And so when I started university, I was more in what they call international studies. But then the more I learned about economics and how it's a bit of a plumbing discipline, in the sense that you don't see the way in which it works, but it affects every aspect of our lives. And so when you think about unemployment, that's not just something that happens to one person. It's a phenomenon in an economy. When you think about inflation, it's not just that the merchant decided to increase its price because of X or X reasons, right? And so I found that economics was actually a discipline in which you work on analytical topics that have a lot of importance for everyday life in a lot of different ways. And I think that's what I like about it quite a lot.
So on this podcast, we like to say that, like you, we agree that climate change, not like you agree that economics intersects with everything. And we like to think that climate change intersects with everything. So I'd love to understand how you see climate change and economics intersecting.
That's very true. So, climate change intersects with everything. Where it intersects with economics is that, we tend to think initially about climate change as something that is physical, right? We think of rising temperature, we think of rainfall becoming less predictable, we think of the physical consequences of this. But these have severe economic implications. And as we see temperature rising, as we see rainfall patterns changing, it has lots of implication on every aspect of the economy. And so I don't want to anticipate much on the further conversation on the report, but that's what this does, right? So if you think about heat, like extreme heat, has impacts on productivity. It has an impact on crop development. If you think of extreme rainfall events, it has an impact on your infrastructure. And so it's sort of all of it through different channels have an impact on the economy, and that's also why it's so important to be very cognizant of the intersection between the two and the risks that climate poses to the economy, but also how economic policies can respond to these risks, right? So there's a bit of a conversation here.
Okay, so what does a senior economist do? And in your case, thinking about this report, when you say your focus was on macroeconomics and public finance, what were you looking at? What was your role in all of this?
Yeah. So as senior economist, I can do many different things. In my line of work, I think I'm quite privileged to work at the intersection of analytics and policy, right? So what I do in my day-to-day work is use analysis, consume analysis, and then try to understand and translate this analysis into applications for policy and for how we should conduct policy. And so it's really a bridge between the discipline of economics. I have colleagues that are senior economists that just do research. I have colleagues that are senior economists that just do operational work and do like building projects. I sit in between the two. So I consume a lot of analysis and I try to use it to inform the policy dialogue with the countries that I work on.
So give me an example.
So for instance, if you look at, is there a topic that you prefer? And because it's wide ranging.
Agriculture.
I shouldn't have asked. But for instance, so we would have colleagues at the World Bank, but of course in other institutions that do research on those topics. And that will find perhaps that the best way to resilience in the agricultural sector through extensive empirical analysis and field work, etc., we'll find out that what works best to increase resilience is probably maybe introducing crop-resistant, weather-resistant, climate-resistant crops, for instance. And so the senior economist, which is not me in the agriculture case, but my colleague who's the senior agriculture economist, will then go on and then to think about how, in the Ugandan context, what does this mean? Where does Uganda stand in terms of introducing these climate-resistant crops? What are the policies that are needed to foster the introduction of those and to make sure that they're wide-ranging? And then discuss with the government as to how to implement those policies and what are the very practical questions to ask for this to materialize, right? For farmers to use more climate-resistant crops, and so we are exposed to a lot of analysis, to a lot of reports and a lot of research, and we need to think about how we translate that research into policy.
So is that speaking to? I would like you to speak to the macroeconomics and the public finance side when you're thinking about. I don't want to say the acronym for this report, but at the same time...
The report that should not be named through its acronym.
Yeah.
Yes, so we have maybe a triple role to play in those reports, which I believe is quite critical. The first one is that we need to quantify the effects of climate change on an economy, in this case on the Ugandan economy. Most analysis that you will see, and that's where really the value added of this report that should not be named by this acronym, what the value added of this report is that we know the channels through which climate change impacts the economy. We know that it has an impact on labor productivity, and we know that it has an impact of the infrastructure. We know that it has an impact maybe on some countries on tourism demand. We know all of this. we don't know how to prioritize. Well, we didn't know, or we didn't have the tools to understand how to best prioritize. What is going to have the most effect? What should be the priority for a given country? And what we do in the macro team for that is that we quantify through experts, through using all of the research that exists, we put all of these channels through which climate change affects the economy into one macro model. And what that enables us to do is to say, well, the bulk of the effect of climate change will come through channel 1, 2, 3. And yes, there are other ways through which it will affect the economy. But in terms of how big or severe the effect is, here is where it will really come from. And then we work with our colleagues in the poverty practice, and what they will do is they will use the results from the macro, and they will say, well, given where the population in this country is situated, given what livelihoods they rely on, these people in these places are going to be the most affected. And so in the macro team, what we do is we really try to bring it all together. And so we will look at an economy without climate change, and we'll say, well, if nothing happened, if the climate conditions would stay the same, here where we would be in 2050. And then we say, but because of all these climate shocks that come in, because of these channels through which climate change will impact the economy, we will be, in this case, 3% lower than we would have been. And out of this percentage, half of it will come through this channel. And so it really helps to understand better what are the key risks. It's not about knowing what the long list of risks. I mean, there are many reports that do this, that highlight different channels through which it will affect the economy. But this one really brings it together. So maybe I said 3 things.
Okay.
I'll be short on the following one. The second one is that we work with all of the sector colleagues. So we're the macroeconomists, we're also the integrator with all of our sector colleagues that work on energy, that work on agriculture, that work on education. And so we will work with all of them to understand what should the response be in their field, how much would it cost, and also what would be the benefits. What does it mean that instead of this road budget costing this much, well, the road budget will actually start decreasing in size because you will have used these resilient infrastructures, for instance. And then we do the same thing. We bring it all back into a macro model, and we say, well, if we were to implement this set of policy actions, here's what the result would be. And so really in a cross-cutting way. And then the third thing is the public finance hat. So we can discuss maybe a bit later on the public finance
Yes, I
side.
have a number of questions on that one.
But our role is to understand what the implications for public finance would be and how to best respond.
So the report that we're trying not to mention in acronym form is the Uganda Country Climate and Development Report, and it was launched last month in September. There's so many reports out there. There's just too many reports. Why do we find the need to keep putting out these reports? What sets this particular one apart?
You mean, why is this one different?
Mm-hmm.
Or so it's a great question, because there are indeed a lot of reports, but I have my bias as a macroeconomist, right? So the value added I see links to what I was mentioning earlier. We don't have a good sense of what are the key risks. We don't have a good sense of prioritization. We don't have a sense of what would be the benefits, right? If you want to convince a government to invest, scarce resources into one problem, you really need to make the case that this is the one problem which will be the most determinant in 10 years, in 15 years' time. And you can do that by just saying it. You can do that maybe in a better way by quantifying what the effect will be and how it will affect people. And so that's maybe the first thing. And the second thing is that it really brings it all together, right? And when we think about the response to climate change, we need to bring about a series of different interventions. And again, so think of it maybe as the how to say this, but the it tries to be comprehensive, right? And so we will again discuss with all the sector colleagues and all the sectoral analysis, and we'll bring it all together, which means that we have to be extremely consistent, right? We cannot say you need to invest this much there and this much there and not add it up. It needs to add up, right? And if you do a report solely on one sector and you say here are the needs are probably very large, but you can't think about how you can design a policy package that does all of this at the same time in a way. So this report, what it does, because it brings it all together and it helps prioritizing, it also helps into thinking about how we should, sequence and prioritize. So in a way, it tries to, and it uses, all of these reports that have been, done by research centers and professors and multilateral research institutions. We all use them. We just try to have a bit of a synthesis that is actionable, right? I think it's easier said than done, and we get one step further into making it actionable.
You keep saying we, and what happens when this report is launched? So it was launched in September. What follows? Who do you hand it over to? How is it actioned? I never know what happens after that part of it.
So maybe I'll just start to say by that the report and its launch is not the beginning of something. Mm-hmm. It's a milestone in a policy dialogue that has been ongoing for years, right?
Okay.
And so there are already things that are being done that have started, and this report wants to maybe give it a big push, right? By also making it clear, and not only to maybe the technical expert in the ministry, but making it clear to the general public, to the government, that this is a priority, and that this needs to be addressed. So what happens, hopefully, after it is launched, is that the efforts that have begun are amplified. Areas maybe that have been overlooked are actually starting to be addressed as well. And so, again, it's not a one-off. The report is one thing. It contributes to a broader dynamic in terms of governments and societies addressing the challenges posed by climate change.
I suspect that by the World Bank constantly doing these reports, there must be something that's showing that they're being used and they're making a difference. What have you seen that's come out of similar reports previously, maybe here in Uganda or elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I should start by mentioning that these are fairly recent. So I think it's maybe the 4th or 5th year. Hope my manager isn't listening to this podcast. So basically these have been, that have begun recently, and in the end they cover now over 100 countries. And so I think that development partners, when we discuss with them in governments, they understand what's in there. So I like to think that it fuels into their work program. At the World Bank, more specifically, we have, if you look at the report, it will have tables of recommendations, right? It will have priorities. And this directly informs how we design operations in the country, right? We really try hard to be extremely consistent. So whenever we design an operation in whichever sector, it will go and it will say, well, in the CCDR, sorry, I didn't mean to say CCDR.
I think
that's
at this
a very
point we
opaque
know
word
what it is.
for something that's very clear.
Yeah.
But in the country climate and development report, this has been identified as a priority, and this has been identified as a priority for these reasons. And so the operational program of the World Bank will aim to address this constraint or this problem, this emerging challenge that has been identified in the CCDR. So we operationalize the recommendation. We try to operationalize the recommendations. I think I saw an example maybe a year or two ago, but again, it was recent. Morocco was one of the first countries that did the report, and the water and agricultural sector was actually designing an operation that would be clear follow-up from the recommendations of the country climate and development report.
Is there anything that surprised you from the Uganda report?
So I'm new to the Uganda context. I've been working on Uganda for a few months. I was impressed by the number of my internal migration that climate, for instance, would generate. I think it's about 12 million people, and this is massive, and it forces you to think about, well, if population migration is going to evolve in that direction at that scale, you need to think about redesigning your infrastructure. You need to be redesigning cities. You need to be thinking about how all of your public services have to adapt, right? So I think for me that's something that was striking in the report. But it's not the only thing. I don't know how many you want, but
Three.
So I've said one. I think the second one maybe would be that in the report we look at the cost, right? We look at the cost of climate action, and in many areas, and so usually these costs are huge and they're scary, right? In many areas they were actually almost the same amounts as the government had envisaged in the Vision 2040, Tenfold Growth Strategy, which are very, very significant amounts. And so what that tells you is that basically we're not talking about, finding all of these, new, putting the ambition higher, much higher than previously. But what we're saying is that we should make sure that this spending, that this investment is actually climate effective, because if you were already intending on doing a certain number of things, then you just need to make sure that this goes in the right direction and that this is climate informed, so as not to generate additional costs, right? You want a third one that I found surprising? Maybe I'm already blasé. No, and I think one of the you might want to touch upon that a bit later, but and it's something that I've seen in other reports like this, is the scale of the opportunities for the private sector, especially especially in Uganda, because the sectors that require a lot of efforts into adaptation are private sector led, the agricultural sector, for instance, right, the construction sector, and we had this. I presented the CCDR to a private sector audience a month ago, a week after the official launch, and I was really impressed as to how much enthusiasm there was, because one thing that it really makes clear is that there's a lot of wiggle room for private sector action, and maybe we'll come to the financing at some point. But I found that quite encouraging, because in some countries, it's a lot of public spending.
So the private sector sees their role clearly.
I believe they do, and I believe they didn't wait for the report to. I think it's something that's quite. If I walk into the street and I talk to anybody, any Ugandan, randomly, they all know about climate change, because either they work in the agricultural sector and they're well aware of what's different compared to 10 years ago, or they work in construction and they're well aware of the challenges that they face because of climate. And in the similar way, the private sector knows what they can be good at in this transition, right? And so often the report calls for the right policies to support a private sector investment. I used to work on Algeria, which is an oil and gas producing country, and e-mobility, electric mobility, is nowhere to be seen, as in a lot of countries. And then when I moved here, and I started seeing e-bikes, I was amazed. So I mean, again, I think oftentimes the private sector is pretty good at identifying the opportunities from emerging trends, and so they didn't wait for the report to get on board in a way. I think they welcomed more like the message that the government should support the development of green sectors on which they're already trying to engage, maybe.
And so my question was actually going to be around the government's response to this report.
It was very positive. I mean, and perhaps I should start by saying that it's something that we do with the government, right? So there's a lot of interaction with the government as we produce this report, because we need the expertise of the ministries, we need the experience of the administration to bring realism as well to recommendations, to understand how it affects. So there has been, I can't remember how many, but many rounds of consultations at different levels, civil society, private sector, government. And so this is something we've been engaging with the government on much before the launch. So it's not something that they discovered when we invited them to the report launch. And I think it's quite positive, because there are many things that are being done that don't have much visibility. And I think these these events around those reports help give visibility and credibility to some of the efforts that have been ongoing, and maybe get more of a consensus to push further in that direction.
So as you've probably guessed, agriculture is a very important area for me, and so I want to zoom in on that one. We know what agriculture looks like in Uganda. You're speaking about us going on the street and just finding out that almost everybody, if you ask anyone, William, you have a farm, right? You're engaged in agriculture in some way. All of us, almost. I
just planted a lot of cucumbers, carrots, and a bunch of herbs in my garden. I think you have such a fertile land that it would be a pity not to do it.
They say we just throw something somewhere and then tomorrow we're eating something. But we know that this sector touches on a lot of Ugandans. What does this report say about how we can make agriculture more resilient and less vulnerable to climate shocks?
Mm-hmm. So the report zooms in on the agricultural sector for reasons you mentioned. And maybe just as an introduction, one of the high value added of the analysis that it's done is that it really shows how climate change will affect agriculture differently depending on where you live, depending on what you grow, and gives very good visibility. Again, it's not the only report that does this, but it sort of tries to quantify, right, and think in terms of livelihoods as well of the farmers. So it's very rich in that sense. And then the recommendations, I mean, so there are many, there are huge needs for the agricultural sector. I think one of them is irrigation. I mean, relying on increasingly erratic rainfall is a challenge. You cannot do, if you have a good year, maybe you have a bad year. And so irrigation is one of the ways in which you build resilience, and that's something that's emphasized in the report. There are a lot of recommendations that revolve around just practices about, planting practices, livestock practices that are more sustainable. It emphasizes also the importance of, like, for instance, clean cooking maintaining also maintaining proper land management, right? So the use of forest, which, as we know, is one of the barriers against heat. So better land use. So it really looks at a series of interventions in the agricultural sector, recognizing that, in particular for Uganda, agriculture is the backbone of the economy, and so it needs to be prioritized. And it also, I think, it speaks also to how do you empower farmers, right, to become more resilient. And so there was just for the anecdote, but a mission, so colleagues coming from HQ for the visiting field.
HQ is headquarters.
I am sorry about this, and I'm really trying here.
You're really trying. You're doing really well.
But for instance, where the World Bank was supporting farmers using artificial intelligence, for instance, to better understand what are good agricultural practices, and I think they were testing if it was accurate in Uganda to be able to communicate with the farmers. So I think it's a lot about empowering the farmers also to be able to implement, because in the end it's not a policy. You can't impose good practices. They have to be adopted. And so it's I think an important focus.
So beyond agriculture, and I don't want to dwell so much on the areas that are important to me. I think it's important that people are getting enough interest to go and look up the report and read it. Beyond agriculture, the report touches on infrastructure, health, education, urban growth. Any of these that I've mentioned, or some that I haven't, and you already spoke about the private sector, what stood out for you that's urgent?
So one of the, and again, it's maybe a bit more specific to Uganda, but the health aspect. So in climate, in many countries, health and climate is a challenge, but in Uganda it seemed like something major, because heat, brings about development of some diseases, and so it could amplify some of the public health challenges. So one of the things that the report does is look at how do you build resilient health systems to address the risks that climate change, and in particular higher heat, will bring for diseases. And then one other maybe salient challenge is the one on infrastructure, right? So for countries that Uganda's level of development, it's developing the basic infrastructure for economic activities. We're thinking roads, we're talking electricity, we're talking even digital infrastructure, are the key investments, the enablers, right? And they enable economic activity, they enable structural transformation, right? They enable people to move from agriculture to other sectors, rural areas to cities. So these basic infrastructures are at risk from climate change. For instance, on roads, if you don't have climate resilient roads, then you will have increasingly more extreme weather events that will prevent mobility, that will delay trade flows or deliveries. Maybe a food truck will be delayed, and then the food will go bad. I mean, so these are.
Or a bridge will collapse.
Or a bridge will collapse, and then you won't be able to carry merchandise. Electricity is one of the other examples. I think so. The report says something like about 20% of the Uganda electricity network is highly exposed to extreme weather events, and so electricity cuts is something that prevents not only light in your house, but also manufacturing plants to work. Right. So building resilient infrastructure is an emphasis of the report that is quite important.
So I asked you to choose one, but then I know we've had a number of podcasts that allow us to understand that there's something being done in the health sector, there's something being done, or that these thoughts around infrastructure. What we haven't looked at here has been education. Mm-hmm. Do you want to share a bit of what the report is saying about that?
On education, so reports like this, they look at education from the lens of resilience and of building the right skills for a climate resilient economy. So they usually think about the types of skills that are needed. In the case of Uganda, one of the things that I thought was very interested in is. It starts from something else. So it starts about lower productivity from higher heat. Mm-hmm. And this is affecting most the workers that work in agricultural sector, but also retailers, right? You can think about retailers in the cities, or bodas, if you want to hear, right? And so as you develop a climate strategy and climate-informed development, the structural transformation that needs to take place requires new skills, right? Requires different skills than before, and so there was this one interesting part where we show which are the occupations, the jobs that are more exposed, and in Uganda, most of the jobs are very highly exposed because of agriculture, because of construction, because of retail, and it showed which are the types of jobs that are less exposed. So where do we want workers to, which sectors do we want workers to migrate into?
I'm very curious.
I mean, usually those are either like indoors, right? Because of this labor heat stress channel that I was mentioning. Services sector are usually also less exposed. I mean, not the retail type, not the small shop in the street type. But even the manufacturing ones are usually indoor, for instance. And so if you want this type of job transformation, you want workers progressively to migrate to these sectors, you need the skills you need to provide the skills that would enable them to work in those sectors. And so in terms of education, I think it's in the report speaks to the importance of adapting educational systems so that they support the transition that's needed in the face of climate change and climate risks.
So the report lays out a long list of recommendations, from youth jobs to climate smart infrastructure, so things we've been speaking about. It's ambitious, and I feel like it's a little bit overwhelming. Where do we start? If the ball was in your hands and you aren't the senior economist who is just handling things from behind the scene, but you are the guy actioning things, where would you start?
You need to prioritize, but you also there are many facets to the challenge. So you don't have to choose all the time, right? So what you really want is that there is, a movement towards addressing the challenges in all different areas. And again, it's not something that starts with the report. It's something that's been ongoing. So you want to be able to accelerate in different issue areas that are most relevant to Uganda. And when we talk about prioritization, usually we talk a bit more about the money, because you don't have to choose to look at legislation in the agricultural sector and legislation or institutional reform in, say, the electricity sector. You have different sets of people working on these two things, so you can have this reflection go on at the same time. If you have to choose where to put scarce resources in, is where you have to prioritize a bit more.
And I was just going to add that we are just getting into the start of a national budget cycle, the new cycle. So if we're thinking the government, the private sector, but I think you've just answered it, that you can't, every sector has to sort of prioritize its own areas that are key, and that all comes together. Or am I being too simplistic?
No, I think that's exactly right. Every sector has to prioritize it. And I was mentioning earlier the example of this ambition and the spending that was in the government strategy, and the fact that the amounts were similar than what the report would suggest is necessary for reinforcing the resilience in a sector. So it's often about repurposing, right? Or it's about deciding, we want to make this spending in a climate-informed way. And one of the things we've been working with the government, and it's the same day of the launch, there was the launch of a climate strategy. There was also something about climate tagging. Climate tagging is jargon for how do you assess whether all types of public spending are climate spending or climate informed. How do you prioritize projects that have climate co-benefits, if you want, right?
But I also now want to get into the private sector that you started to speak about earlier. The report heavily focuses on what the government needs to do. But the private sector and even the communities. So I'm really very interested in smallholder farmers in northern Uganda. those communities?
You're being very specific for a macroeconomist.
I'm not going to be very specific. I'm just giving an example of a community. What role do they play? And maybe not that individual, but think about the private sector. What role do they play in this transformation?
Mm-hmm. So maybe to rewind a little bit, but one of the important findings of the report is that public sector can't do it alone, right? The investment needs are very high, and depending on the sector, it can be spending that needs to be entirely done by the public sector. If you think about early warning systems, it's a public sector issue. If you think of e-mobility, it's mostly a private sector issue, with, of course, support from the public sector and to provide the enabling environment. And so you go so you start thinking about how do you ensure that this level of investment is materializing, and you realize that the public sector cannot do it alone. And then you think about what about external resources, and then you see the amounts, and especially in the current conjuncture, and you see, well, it's not going to make the bulk of the difference. And so one of the questions that the report really wants to ask is, how do you mobilize the resources from outside, either public resources or external resources? And the private sector there has a key role to play. In some sectors, it's maybe half of the investment that's needed in a sector, right? If the government helps in providing, electric charging stations, then the private sector has an incentive to have more green vehicles, right? And so one of the things that I'm getting to, the question you asked initially, so the private sector is key in that. The private sector is not just firms, is individuals as well, right? So, and I can't really speak to smallholder farmers in northern Uganda, and maybe just to say that it is a public sector report, right, in the end. So it's about thinking, how does the government crowd in? Well, crowding in is maybe, I don't know if it's a technical term or not, but ensure that the private sector also invests, ensures that maybe smallholder farmers want to invest in climate resilience. And that can be by providing incentives, that can be by providing the right legal framework, by norms, less sexy topics, for macroeconomists at least. And so the report asks these questions as well. As I mentioned, there were also consultation with civil society. We had the agricultural representatives at the launch as well, that were trying to bring in their perspective. And even though, it is just a start. We don't stop analytical work on climate with the country climate and development report, right? So then there will be follow-ups on the agricultural sector.
So we're trying to get everybody to participate.
We are trying to make a clear point that it's an everybody problem, and that it's an everybody solution as well. The public sector has a big role to play, but the public sector cannot do it alone, and so it means that everyone needs to sort of contribute if you want to properly address the challenges posed by climate change.
A lot of funding around climate change issues has always been from elsewhere. And I know that the report starts to talk about, maybe not starts, but actually talks about options for what funding for climate change would look like. Could you share with us some of the mechanisms that are proposed to support Uganda's adaptation?
Mm-hmm. From a resilience point of view, one of the most important things is that Uganda's own revenue be able to sustain this effort, right? So we're talking about equitable taxations, right? We're talking about it's the environmental taxation, but I know taxes are not a very popular topic. So it's a bit first best in terms of resilience. But then there are a number of tools, a bit more innovative tools in climate financing that the government is looking into, and they launched the climate finance strategy at the same time as the report was being launched. And so there are, for instance, there are financial instruments that look at the specific target for a country, right? For instance, they say, well, they said the country strategy says that it will achieve 50%, 100% green energy by this date. And so there is concessional financing, so financing with better terms than if you would go to a bank to borrow, that look at this, and they're called sustainability linked financing, and say, well, if you achieve these targets, then the cost of the borrowing will go down as well, right? There are also purely concessional sources. So you have the climate investment fund, there are 2 or 3 investment funds that just you can mobilize their resources. But in general, it's more about financial tools to attract more concessional financing by linking it to climate commitments.
I don't know if you use Boda Bodas.
I was on a Boda Boda this morning.
Okay.
But I hope my wife doesn't listen to this podcast because she knows I don't have a helmet, and I will hear about it for the whole weekend.
I hope she does. If you were to tell this Boda Boda rider something about this report, what would you want them to take away?
Specifically Boda Bodas.
Just anybody, but I'm going to start with a Boda Boda rider.
That's a complicated question.
He's picking you up from, where was the report launched? I think it was at Ssekiranda or somewhere.
Yes, it was launched at Ssekiranda.
And he says, what have you been doing there? Because now you're friendly. And what are you saying? We're launching
a report on climate.
Why should I care?
Why should you care? You should, coming back to what I was mentioning about going to anybody in the street and they all have something to say about climate, even if it's not articulated in that way, right? Mm-hmm. So they should care because the temperatures are rising, right? They should care because increasingly fuel is going to be getting more expensive. They should care because the pollution that it's creating is harming them. And so green future is something that everybody has something to win in, right? And so the Boda Boda, when you said, what would you tell them, is what would you advise? And I would say, well, change this to a e-bike. And I've seen a couple of these e-motorbikes, right? And these are the future. And so even the Boda driver has interest in this climate transition taking place for very different reason than agricultural farmers. But in the end, each one of us has interest in that transition succeeding.
Do you think that the heat is much worse when you have a helmet on than when you don't have one? So a thing that I found very useful for me in the report was there was a bit of a focus on women and refugees. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in that. What role do they play in our development strategy?
Women and refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife is a gender specialist working on climate.
I hope she's listening.
Maybe I'll start with the basic.
And while you're answering that, whichever way you start, how do we ensure that them being included in conversations around climate change is not just symbolic, but there's actually something coming out of that?
Again, you're asking much from a macroeconomist, but us macroeconomists, we tend to have a very functional view of these things, and women are half of the workforce. Women are also, when we talk about the challenge related to health, usually primary caregivers for children, and half of this country is children.
When you say children, it just, okay, no below the age of what, 17?
Usually we think of 18 where I come from, but okay. Yeah. So definitely, women have a huge role to play in that transition. And so they are, in many ways, if you want to design an intervention around health and climate change, you need to be able to reach out to women. You need to be able to understand their challenges. And when I was mentioning, for instance, that we have teams that look at the poverty effects or the differential effect of climate change on different regions, they also look at the differentiated effects on women. And if women, as is often the case, are more active in the agricultural sector, then they are the main agent of change in that sector. And if we think of in the health sector, the example, coming back to the example from earlier, well, if you want to make sure that the policy, a public health policy that targets children, is climate informed, and that the risks are laid out, and that the solutions in terms of health interventions are clearly understood and are used, well, women are often the primary target for these interventions. And so they have a key role to play, especially in sectors and in channels in which they are the bulk of the agents, as we like to say in economic jargons, right? And similarly for refugee, I was mentioning earlier that one of the surprises in the report is 12 million migrants. So it's not only refugees, and so I mean there are already climate refugees. And Uganda is already a host of climate refugees that can come from more desertic regions of the north. If there is a food crisis because of a drought in the region, it will be a Uganda challenge as well, right? And because refugees are a big part of this country in terms of people, but in terms of the economy as well, they're very much integrated in the economy. They need to be part of the solution as well. And because they are often outside, say, of the realm of public policy interventions, then maybe particular attention need to be paid to how do you also enlist them in this effort.
What informed the data that informed? What informed this report? Where was this data coming from?
It comes from. So it's huge, right? So it touches upon every sector of the economy, more or less, right? So I mean, at the bank we almost always only use official data. So of course it's also an emphasis of the report often is to generate the data that is needed in order to better understand and to better respond to climate change. So official data. So on the macro side, on the macroeconomic aspects, of course, and it's mostly UBOS, Ministry of Finance. On the sector side, oftentimes it's the line ministries. So would it be in agriculture, for irrigation, the data would come from them. Household data are a really important source of information because they enable us to say something a lot more granular about who, where, how will be impacted, to understand how to better design policies in response. So on the microeconomic side, we say like household data is a key source. You have enterprise surveys often that try to understand how firms are preparing or how unprepared they are for the challenges from climate change. You have a lot of ad hoc surveys. So for instance, if you wanted to understand about refugees, it's not something that the National Census would be particularly good at, right? So surveys would be needed to inform how these specific population respond or how they're affected also by climate change. But in terms of maybe I should have started this way, but in terms of understanding what is climate change, we rely on global scenarios, right? Okay. So there are thousands of climate scenarios, and what the report does broadly is that it would select a few scenarios that are, we would have a dry and hot scenario and a warm and wet scenario, and so it will go and pick from a lot of these models that model how temperatures will change and how rainfall will change. And then so we'll use climate scenarios. Then we'll use the macroeconomic data to understand how this will affect people. And then we'll use the microeconomic data, so the household surveys I mentioned. And then when we think about the responses, the needs, the responses, then we'll look at sectoral data.
And I know that the report was also speaking about a 10-year test.
A 10-year test.
Yes.
The 10-year test being what will be done in 10 years.
What will it look like in 10 years so that when we are designing interventions or designing bridges and roads and so on, we are thinking that way?
I mean, so we're hopeful that in 10 years, climate change will be, maybe we won't even need to mention climate change, and we'll just have climate resilient policies, right? Maybe every aspect of policy will be informed by these challenges. And hopefully we will have made some good progress on implementing some of the report's recommendation in key issue areas.
So for journalists, researchers, and even students that might listen to this podcast, how would they access this data and be able to dig deeper or even build on it? Where do we find this report?
So most of the data used in the report is publicly available data. It's just that our team has made this massive effort to bring it all together into one consistent story, if you want. So the data I mentioned on the climate change data is available on the climate change knowledge portal of the World Bank. There are other institutions also that present them. The macroeconomic data is all data that's available on ministry and UBAS websites.
But if I want this consolidated piece of knowledge?
To my knowledge, there's no one.
So this report?
So this report, you would have to talk to lots of different teams within the bank.
To get the report. It's not a public report.
To get the data that was used for the report.
No, to get this report.
Oh, the report. You go online.
I was trying to give you an opportunity to say the World Bank website.
I am sorry. Because we were talking about data and I'm a data person, and so I was like, you want all of the data? How do we get all of the data? I don't even have all the data. I need to ask probably like 10 people to get all of the data. No, of course. So the day that the report was launched, it was also available on the World Bank website. There's a Uganda page on the World Bank website that has all of the latest in terms of publications from the bank. You can ask your favorite AI assistant to fetch it for you and to give you a link. That's what I do nowadays.
And summarize it for me.
And summarize it for you. As a researcher myself and as a user of artificial intelligence, I would advise that if you're going to ask it to summarize and use something, you would ask it to quote the sentences that it's using from, because oftentimes there are still some discrepancies. Don't get me wrong, I use AI a lot in my work, but I also...
You can't avoid it.
You can't avoid it? Well, some people still do. But
they're better people than the rest of us.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Let's imagine 2035, and this is my last question. 2035, maybe it's not you, maybe it's another senior economist from the World Bank, and we're sitting here again. How likely is it that we'll be looking back at this report as the moment Uganda truly began to act on climate and development together?
Again, not at all, because the efforts have started already. I hope that we will remember the launch of the Country Climate and Development Report more as a milestone in how to get all of the different parts of society to buy into a climate-informed future. The government on many levels is cognizant of those challenges, right? People are cognizant, but it's this massive, not rethinking, but maybe rethinking about how we should think about issues and how to address them, which requires everybody to pitch in: government, private sector firms, individuals, and how we should all think about that climate resilient future is not an option, right? And maybe this is one of the moments in which we realize that it's like with AI, right? Before you start anything, maybe you ask AI. Or before you start anything, maybe you wonder, is this climate resilient? Will this project last? Will this economic endeavor by a business be still be relevant in 10 years because of the challenges that climate change poses. So I hope that we look at it as another milestone, and maybe one in which we are more conscious of the challenges and more conscious of the solutions as well. Because in the end, what this report does is it tries to provide a lot of solutions in every different fields, with cost, with caveats, with challenges, with risks, but really a set of solutions to address the challenges posed by climate change.
Thank you so much, Cyril.